When I think of toddler development, I think of John Piaget's theory on egocentrism. But is this theory really applicable in toddlerhood? So I'm going to debate this topic through toddler sharing, which brings me to my oral presentation today. Alright, so we're going to go over is all about me, study 1, study 2 by our peer-reviewed journal articles, and then social development and the conclusion. And then, whoa, hey, my name is Jada. I'm a toddler educator, which shows, and that's why I chose my topic today, because I have a certain type of expertise on the subject. Alright, so study 1 by my peer-reviewed journal, and I'm giving all the credit to the authors, is Mine or Yours, Development of Sharing and Toddler Relation to Ownership and Understanding. So this is what we're going to go over in study 1, so the experiment phases 1 and 2, and the result. So the main idea of this experiment was if infants and toddlers had an understanding of reciprocity. So then we move on to the process. So for the process, the understanding, so what they did was they had the children go into a room and watch videos for phase 1 and phase 2. So the phase 1 consisted of watching videos of the pro-social and the anti-social sharing with the toddler, or just the pro-social sharing with the toddler. And then they would go into a room and then they would do a hands-on experiment with this where the toddler had the crackers, whatever was an interest for the child, and then they would share using the crackers and see if they would share or not. And then with phase 2, it was just the pro-social and the anti-social that shared with each other in the video and not the child. And then they would go into the hands-on experience where they found that the pro-social, when the child had the opportunity to share, if they would share with the pro-social and the anti-social that didn't share with the child. And then throughout the process, for the bias, they took a very big part in the bias. So the bias had to be like 36-month-old children. They had to be all from the same middle class. They took a big focus on bias. And then the experimenters had to be covered from head to toe so that the child wouldn't have a preference to either one of the antisocial or the pro-social. And that's what leads me into the next part. Alright, so moving on to phase 1 and 2 combined results. So the congruent toddler sharing, we found that the majority of children were able to share regardless of if it was a pro-social or anti-social, and then 25% of the children just didn't really have a response to it. They didn't really share, and this is all through toddlers, but they just weren't really active in the study. And then moving on to preference to pro-social versus anti-social. So as we see, the dark gray represents the pro-social and the anti-social is the light gray, and we found that in both studies, the pro-social that really was more reactive and responded more to the child, that the child was more prone to respond to them. That really shows the social learning that was taking place. So learners who are more engaged in depth with the child showed a bigger response in how they learn. Alright, so 6-month-old versus the 20-month-old. So the 6-month-old was not there yet in their development to be able to respond to reciprocity. They didn't have a preference to anti or pro-social. And then the 20-month-old was able to demonstrate the idea of reciprocity, and they were able to share with the others. Alright, so study 2, Mine or Yours, and giving all credit to the peer-reviewed journal. So Mine or Yours, Development of Sharing in Toddlers and Relationship of Ownership and Understanding. So moving on, so this is what the study is going over today. Alright, so the process, the main idea, and the bias. So the process of this experiment was a little bit different. So this one, they really focused on ownership and sharing. So they had 2 different experiments they covered. One was about 6 steps, and then for the sharing aspect, and then the other one was ownership to see if the child could understand ownership, and that's how they set it up. So the main idea in this one was to see if children could understand ownership and if it correlated with sharing. And then the biases, they didn't really have a preference in bias. Even with the girls and boys, they didn't show any difference. So there was no bias, unlike the other journal article that played a big factor. Okay, so moving on. So 6 steps. So something you need to know about this is they went to 1 to 7 seconds before moving on to the next step. And in this process, the start of the process, they dumped out crackers and toys on the table as a sharing and there was no preference for the child and how they responded, so that the responses to this study were conclusive. And then the AE would take away the crackers to the assistant experimenter, and then the experimenter would sit with the child, and they would go through all 6 of the steps. Okay, so moving on to the 6 steps and what the studies kind of went over. So the 18-month-old were the light gray and the 24-month-old. So we really found in the 2 different stages of toddlerhood that the 24-month-old was able to really, they were able to share right away before getting into the different steps of the cues. Like in the first step, they were more spontaneous in sharing. And then the 18-month-old, it really took a lot of prompting to really get them to share. So those are what the studies concluded there. All right, so ownership and understanding. So then we move on to the next little experiment they did throughout the study. And this one was to understand the concept of ownership. And through this one, they had the children, so to prevent bias in this study, they had, so some children are not very communicative yet with their verbal. So they were able to make sure that the child still had an understanding of ownership. It didn't relate to any factors if they could or couldn't speak yet, or if their words weren't more prominent. The first task focused on like verbal phrases, and they really in the study really took a fact on like the wording they used. And then the second one was more like hands-on, and it was more lab process. So like in the second one, for example, they had like items that the child wasn't familiar with. Like they weren't home items, and they weren't something that the child was really familiar with, which created a more challenging aspect of the study. Okay, so part 2. So what we found from the results is that the 18-month-old was very egocentric. They didn't really have that understanding of egocentrism yet. It was out of there. It was too challenging or complex for their state of development. And it took a lot of prompting, so they were more egocentric in that matter. It was more about them. But we found with the 24-month-old, they were able to look beyond themselves and share with the related to the social cues and how the experimenter would respond. They were able to understand those like body language that was prompted. All right, so social development. So now we're moving on to our social development. I really want you to take a second and look at this quote by Dorothy Nolche, and I want you to take it in and how it relates to you and what you think of toddler sharing. For me, this quote speaks volumes. And now we're going to move on to the next part. And I'd love for you to email me with what you think. I'd love to hear your response back and what it means to you. All right, so what else is essential? So that quote really pays into my thinking when I think of the social development theory. So now we're in how it relates to Albert Bandura's observational learning theory. So Albert Bandura did a study with Bobo dolls, and they put the kids in, they took similar to the first study, they had children watch videos. And then they would put them into a field in 2 separate. One of the videos was violent, one of them was kind, and then they would see how the children reacted. And same with the children that shared after watching the video was in response to this observational learning that had taken place throughout the study. And then in the second study, in the 6th step of the 6 cues, when the 2 experimenter and AE assistant experiment were sharing, it really prompted particularly the 18-month-old to share. Okay, so that's why observational learning plays a big part in how the children learn about the people and the responders around you, especially in body language. All right, so Levigassi's theory and how it played place into the 2 studies that we did. So with we found that with the 18-month-old, they were kind of, it was very challenging. It was kind of out of their state of development yet. So it was very advanced and tricky. But we found when the experimenters were scaffolding with the 6 steps and cues. They really reached that like challenging but not too tricky part of the zone of proximal development. And with further scaffolding, they will be able to master the subject about sharing and the concept of ownership. And that's how this really played a place in this theory. And then, so we're going to move on to the next part. And also with this study, I found that it really focused on peer influence. So like that more knowledgeable other really played an influence in how the children responded in the theory, which is another theory of Lev-Vygotski's. All right, so why is egocentrism important? So egocentrism, that's like when I think of toddlerhood, I think of egocentrism in the second stage development theory by Piaget. And in this theory, it suggested that toddlers were egocentric. They couldn't look beyond themselves. But in this, circling around to our first question, we kind of focused throughout this study that it wasn't really conclusive to how the children responded. We saw it in the 18-month-old, but even then, they were able, with lots of prompting, to look beyond themselves in the study. And they were able to scaffold from that more knowledgeable others. So really, peer influence took a really big influence in how the child responded. So, and then the 21-month-old and the 24-month-old, they were able to share right away, practically, like the majority of those in that age group. They were able to understand the concept of ownership and how it related to sharing, and also with reciprocity, like using that social learning from others, were really able to share. So they weren't really thinking about themselves, and they were able to look beyond themselves. So it really debunks our theory about egocentrism. All right, so my conclusion. So now we move on to the social development stages that we really looked over, and kind of what I stated in the egocentrism. The 6-month-old, it was like way beyond their development. They're not really there yet. They don't have an understanding of reciprocity. And then the 18-month-old, they were getting there with a little bit more scaffolding. They would be able to really excel and really kind of get that little first understanding of ownership and sharing. And then the 21-month-old and the 24-month-old were able to understand reciprocity and ownership and how it correlated to sharing. And all right, so thank you so much for listening to my seminar today. And I would love for you to ask me any questions, and I'll give you an answer to them. And please send me an email with any questions and that quote and what your thinking is on the subjects that we covered today. Thanks so much. So these are the references I used today. And then hopping